So the next thing that we're going to do with the cerebral hemispheres is consider the features of the surfaces in more detail. So we'll start off with the lateral surface. So the things that we need to know are basically 1, the major sulci of the brain, and 2, the features of each of the lobes of the brain. So we'll start off with the lateral surface. The first thing that you'll notice is a fissure which passes almost horizontally, separating the brain into an upper and lower part. And this fissure is called the Sylvian fissure, or is also known as the lateral sulcus. The other major sulcus that you have on the lateral surface is the central sulcus. It's hard to identify on many specimens, so I'll give you a tip to identify. If you follow the lateral sulcus back, it ends basically in a gyrus here. You pick one gyrus in front of that, and the sulcus in front of that is the central sulcus. So that's the central sulcus there. So remember, you follow the sulcus back, you see this gyrus, pick one gyrus in front of that, and the sulcus in front of that is the central sulcus. The lobes of the brain divided by the sulci are the frontal lobe in front of the central sulcus, the parietal lobe behind the central sulcus, and the temporal lobe below the lateral sulcus. The occipital lobe is behind an arbitrary line on the lateral surface here. The occipital lobe doesn't have many surfaces on its doesn't have many features on its lateral surface, so we're pretty much going to ignore it. But we'll start off with the features of the frontal lobe. So the main feature that you see is there's a big gyrus which lies immediately in front of the central sulcus, and this is called the precentral gyrus, and it's important because it's a important motor area, as we'll see later on. Lying in front of the precentral sulcus, the frontal lobe consists of 3 horizontal gyri. The 3 horizontal frontal gyri. It should be noted that the inferior frontal gyrus is actually split into 3 parts by ascending rami of the lateral sulcus. So the 3 parts of the inferior frontal gyrus include, from front to back, the pars orbitalis. Behind that you've got the pars triangularis, which is this part here, shaped like a triangle, and behind the pars triangularis you have the pars opercularis. The next thing that we have to do before we leave the lateral surface, the next lobe that we need to look at is the parietal lobe. And the parietal lobe, the main feature that you have is firstly, immediately behind the central sulcus, you have the postcentral gyrus, and behind this, the area of the parietal lobe is divided by a horizontally running intraparietal sulcus. Above this sulcus, in this region here, the parietal lobe forms the superior parietal lobule, and below this lobe you've got the inferior parietal lobule. There's 2 really important gyri in the inferior parietal lobule. The first of these is the supramarginal gyrus. The supramarginal gyrus is important because you can tell where it is, it helps identifying landmarks in the brain because it receives in between its 2 banks the lateral sulcus, and the angular gyrus behind it receives the superior temporal sulcus in between its 2 banks as well, and that's really important for identifying where you are in the brain. The final thing that you have to do before we leave the lateral surface is actually open up the lateral sulcus and see what's underneath. And before we do that, you should also note the temporal lobe has superior, middle, and inferior temporal gyri. The next thing you have to do is open up the lateral sulcus, and the main thing that you will see is this circular area of cortex here, which lies quite deeply, and that's called the insula. Now the insula has anteriorly short insular gyri, and posteriorly you've got long insular gyri. And this whole area is circumscribed by a circular sulcus. The final feature that you can see when you open up the lateral sulcus is you've got a number of transverse temporal gyri, and this is quite important functionally, and we'll talk about it later on. We'll now move on to the medial surface. The major structures to note on the medial surface is this huge bundle of white fibers, which is called the corpus callosum. It's not labelled here, but what we'll now do is have a look at the major sulci on the medial surface. So the major sulci on the medial surface, above the cingulate gyrus, which is this gyrus here, you've got the cingulate sulcus, which has an ascending ramus, which you can see here, which passes upwards and separates this gyrus, which we'll name in just a second, from the rest of the medial surface. The other sulci that we have is we have got the central sulcus, which extends onto the medial surface of the brain, and behind we've got the parieto-occipital sulcus, which separates the parietal lobe in front from the occipital lobe behind, and the final sulcus that we have is the calcarine sulcus, which separates the occipital lobe into two parts. All these sulci divide the medial surface of the brain into a number of important areas. Immediately above the corpus callosum we've got the cingulate gyrus. Above the cingulate gyrus we've got two main areas. Around the central sulcus we've got the paracentral lobule, and in front of this we've got the medial frontal gyrus. Behind the ascending ramus of the cingulate sulcus we have the precuneus area, and in the occipital lobe between the parieto-occipital and calcarine sulci we have the cuneus, and below the calcarine sulcus we've got the lingula of the occipital lobe. The medial surface of the temporal lobe is also seen, but we'll study that in more detail once we have a look at the undersurface, which we'll do now. So as you can see, on the undersurface of the brain, the two lobes that you can see are the frontal lobe in front and the temporal lobe behind. With the frontal lobe, the main features that you see are immediately opposite the midline. You have really straight gyri, and that's known as the gyrus rectus. And lateral to this, we have the orbital gyri. Now, separating the gyrus rectus from the orbital gyri, we have the olfactory sulcus, containing the olfactory tract and bulb. If you follow the olfactory tract backwards, it divides into medial and lateral striae, and in between them you've got this little area here, which is known as the anterior perforated substance, and it looks perforated because a number of vessels pierce and supply the deeper structures of the brain in this location. If we now turn our attention to the undersurface of the temporal lobes, we'll note that there's three major gyri. So you've got from medial to lateral the parahippocampal gyrus, then the occipitotemporal gyrus, and these two are separated by an important sulcus known as the collateral sulcus, and finally you've got the inferior temporal gyrus. I don't know why it's labelled as frontal. The inferior temporal gyrus lying lateral to the occipitotemporal. On the undersurface of the brain as well, you can also see a number of important structures which form the floor of the third ventricle. Now, don't worry too much about what the third ventricle is at this stage, but just note from front to back the structures that we have on the base of the brain include the optic nerves, which come together to form the optic chiasm, and the optic chiasm lies in front of the infundibulum and the pituitary. Behind the infundibulum and the pituitary we've got the tuber cinereum. Behind this you've got two lump-like projections called the mammillary bodies, and behind this we've got the posterior perforated substance, which lies in front of the midbrain of the brainstem. Now, I've mentioned a lot of names, and most of them don't seem important at the moment, but the basic arrangement of these structures will become more and more reinforced over time. And that's it when it comes to the surfaces of the brain.